Hey everybody, my guest today is Professor David Magnus, and we're going to talk about normothermic regional perfusion. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
All right, so first, why don't you explain what normothermic regional perfusion is? It sounds like a very technical term.
Yeah, it is a technical term of art. So the first thing to understand, it's about organ procurement. Most organs come from patients who have been declared brain dead. That is, patients who are actively on ventilators and have sufficient damage to their brains, that the permanent, irreversible damage to the brains, so that they've met the criteria for brain death. And that's where most organs come from. A growing number come from something called donation after circulatory death. And in donation after circulatory death, what happens is patients are not dead. They are maintained on ventilatory support, but the decisions have been made already to withdraw life support. And shortly after life support is withdrawn, the patients are declared dead by the criteria of permanent cessation of respiratory and circulatory functions. Once you have permanent cessation of respiratory and circulatory functions, they're declared dead, and then organs are procured. The way they procure these organs traditionally and typically involves taking them, cooling them as rapidly as possible to reduce the amount of ischemic damage that happens, so that you can get the organs to be of adequate quality when you transport them, and then surgically place them into a new body. However, that process is not nearly doesn't produce organs that are usually as good as the organ quality you get from patients who are actively oxygenating blood, as you get in a patient who's brain dead, and therefore the quality of the organs isn't as good. And traditionally, you have not been able to get hearts this way. So two things have changed to make it possible to obtain hearts and to get better quality organs from donation after circulatory death. One is ethically unproblematic, and that is procuring organs and using something called normothermic machine perfusion. And then what you do essentially there is you take the heart or the liver or whatever, and you create what's referred to as like a heart in a box or liver in a box, where you take some blood, you use essentially the equivalent of an ECMO machine, an extracorporeal membrane oxygenation machine, and you oxygenate the blood so that you continue to oxygenate the organ with blood outside the body in a machine, and then transport it that way. And doing that, the data does seem to indicate that you get outcomes by doing this that are comparable to the outcomes you get from brain death, and therefore you can get good quality organs this way. And this is uncontroversial. There's another approach to doing this called normothermic machine perfusion. And again, normothermic meaning that there's no cooling in the way that there is in the protocol I started at the beginning, where you have to take the organs and then cool them right away. In normothermic machine perfusion, instead of taking the organs out and putting them into a box where they're kept at warm, normal temperature, with blood circulating outside the body that way, they procure the organs while blood is still circulating within the body. So how do they do this? So a patient is declared dead because of supposedly permanent cessation of circulatory and respiratory functions. And then what they do is they cut off blood flow to the major vessels to the brain, and then start the body on ECMO, on extracorporeal membrane oxygenation. And then typically what happens in that situation is the heart starts beating on its own again. And it's then much more similar to a brain dead case, where below the neck, the ECMO is circulating the oxygenated blood, and everything's operating normally at that point. And then they procure the organs. And doing this procures organs that are probably slightly better than or at least as good as the organs you get from brain dead. And it does look like there are some, in terms of survivability rates, and there is some evidence that you might have like shorter hospital stays and some other things, some other benefits clinically over normothermic machine perfusion. They're very modest. So NMP looks like it can be roughly as effective as NRP, so normothermic machine perfusion, roughly equivalent to a normothermic regional perfusion. But there is like differences in the hospital stay, length of stay, and other sorts of things There's no evidence that there's differences right now in mortality rates, but there are differences in some secondary results. It also allows for the transplant teams to evaluate how the heart is functioning after circulation is restored and it starts beating on its own. They can look at the heart and see how it's functioning, so they can know more before they procure the heart.
So for normothermic regional perfusion, the heart starts beating again, correct? But
Correct.
the person or the patient isn't breathing. So you still need ECMO to oxygenate the blood. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. So what are the ethical issues there?
Okay, so there's actually a few. The first one is whether or not, in fact, the patients are dead before the procurement takes place. The criteria of death in the cases in donation after circulatory death is permanent cessation of circulatory and respiratory functions. But how can you say that there's permanent cessation of circulatory functions when you restore circulation and the heart starts beating on its own again? So it's all very difficult for many of us to see how that's compatible. I mean, we essentially have two different sets of criteria for death. One is the loss of the functioning of the brain, and the other is the loss of the functioning of circulatory and respiratory functioning. In the case of NRP, they're initially at least declared dead by the permanent cessation, but it's not permanent if you then go ahead and restore it again. So many of us believe that these patients do not meet the Uniform Determination of Death Act's requirement and legal definition of death. And so these patients are not legally dead at the time that the procurements take place. The second ethical issue, so one of the responses to this is, yes, the recirculation has been restored to the heart and it's bleeding again and the organs are going, but circulation doesn't count if it doesn't go to the brain or something along those lines. And the problem with that is the reason why they're not going to the brain is because the teams cut off the circulation knowing they were going to restore that circulation. So the second ethical challenge is that on the best case scenario, the proximate cause of death is the cutting off of the circulation to the brain. And it's hard to see why they have the pretense of waiting. I mean, it is true that if they're successful, there's some questions about whether empirically, whether or not the efforts that are made right now to cut off circulation to the brain are entirely successful, or whether there's actually some blood that's flowing through the spinal column into the brain. But if it turns out they really can figure that part out and stop all blood flow to the brain, it is definitely true that if you do that, a patient will definitely progress to brain death. But then why the pretense of the heart stopping and circulation stopping and waiting 5 minutes and declaring them dead? If you take any patient where, say, the family has decided to withdraw life support or they don't want to be alive like this, you could just go in and cut off the blood flow to the brain without having to do any of the pretense of waiting the 5 minutes after and waiting for circulation to stop. And you could just do the same thing. So the American College of Physicians described this and said this would be better described as a case where you're intending to resuscitate the patient and you intentionally cut off blood flow to the brain so that they don't recover. So again, it seems that the proximal cause of death, either way, the proximal cause of death is either the procurement process itself or the act of cutting off circulation to the brain. And either way, it is difficult to see this as compatible with current laws, both UDDA and laws preventing homicide, because this does seem like you're actively euthanizing the patients, which is currently unlawful in the United States. And then the third ethical challenge, so those are the two big ones. Are they really dead? And two, even if you think they're dead, which I don't, do they actually, is the cause of the death really the action of the physicians? And then the third ethical issue is really around the consent process and how transparent we are about these processes. And it's a little bit scary that the description of this that's being put forward by the American Association of Thoracic Surgeons really does call for being opaque rather than transparent. They've urged people not to use the language of resuscitation, even though ECMO is a resuscitative technology and the heart is resuscitated. Don't call it resuscitation. They've also said don't call it ECMO, because people may think that, that's clearly what they're doing. They say, don't call it ECMO, don't call it ECMO, don't call it resuscitation. Just call it regional perfusion or regional reperfusion or use other much more technical language that people are unlikely to understand. And I think a just general heuristic for ethics is if what you're doing, a key to success is being obfuscatory towards what you're doing and being use misleading language or not tell people the truth about what you're doing. That's probably a pretty good indication that there's ethically something problematic about what you're doing.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that heuristic. All right, so let's kind of go through these ethical issues. So the first big one, which is, are these patients actually dead? And you're leaning towards no. Now, is that due to a judgment in regards to like the legal definition of death, or more like a philosophical?
That for me, that is coming straight from the legal definition. The Uniform Determination of Death Act is pretty clear, and it doesn't reference. The people who defend NRP make a lot of references to things that are not covered in UDDA. They say things like, "Oh, but it's futile anyway," or "the intent is not to resuscitate. The intent is organ procurement." There's nothing about the intention or whether it should count as a resuscitative effort. It just says, actually, the language currently, which is itself challenging, is the language says irreversible, not even permanent. But I think if you look back to the transcripts and the language that was being used, a group of us have a paper on NRP that just came out in the Hastings Center a month or two ago. And one of the authors of that, Alex Capron, was part of the initial discussions that gave rise to the UDDA in the first place. And it was clear that the intention was to distinguish between situations where the patient would recover circulation versus cases where that would not happen. And the UDDA is clearly aimed to say, if circulatory and respiratory functions are never going to be restored, then you're dead. That was clearly the intention behind it. That's clearly the encapsulated in a reasonable interpretation of the language of UDDA, and the efforts to, in fact, introduce ECMO and restore circulation, I believe, violates that, and therefore it fails to meet that standard. More philosophically, we're going to get into much more deep metaphysical waters. And one of the things I like about these kinds of collaborations that we've been doing around brain death and around NRP, what I really like is when you get people with very different philosophical and metaphysical perspectives who don't agree at all on the underlying metaphysics and hence, to some extent, some of the ethical issues, but who nonetheless are able to come to a consensus about the key ethical issues and the principles for how things should proceed, regardless of their underlying metaphysical commitments. So for Jim Burnett, death is really the loss of the functioning of the brain. He thinks that's the only real definition of death. And the reason why there's two sets of standards for that. One is you test for it directly, or when the heart and the respiratory functions are ceased, when cardiac and respiratory functions have ceased, the brain will soon follow, and then we could say they're dead as long as you waited a sufficient time. He's worried, one, that they haven't really established that there's no blood flow to the brain. Two, they don't do any testing to make sure that there's no blood flow to the brain. And three, I think at heart, he agrees with the American College of Physicians. Yes, it's true that they cut off circulation to the brain, which makes the patient dead. But that what really then does all the work is not the heart stopping. It's the cutting off of the blood flow to the brain right before you start it. And so he would definitely put his eggs in the ACP basket of, this is best described as euthanizing the patient by cutting off blood flow to the brain when you intend to restore it. So that's Jim's view and his definition of death and the way he would think about it. In contrast, there are others who think that no, these are separate. I'll say I tend to be more of I guess we could call it a conventionalist or constructivist in my account of death. I don't think that's the same thing. It's arbitrary, but we define death for good reasons in ways that work pragmatically for different purposes, and we're looking for certain kinds of things to create stable understanding of what death is. And so for me, the law says a lot, and it's tied to clinical practice in systematic ways, so that neurologists primarily and some ICU docs are the experts at determining death from a neurological perspective in accord with well-established criteria in a way that's been well-established for over half a century. And that's what death is for that criteria. And the other is equally well-established in both the law and in clinical practice about the permanent loss of respiratory and circulatory functions. And so to me, I don't think that I need to have an overarching concept, philosophical concept of death. I think it's a cluster concept in which we have to figure out where we want to draw the lines that we need to make for practical purposes, and to do that in a very sharp way that makes a sharp distinction between these things for very real practical purposes. For example, determining when can you bury somebody, when does insurance pay off, when does somebody become single and can remarry because their spouse has passed away. And we have this very sharp drawing line for a reason. And then from that perspective, it's pretty clear that that this is not understood and accepted socially, culturally, in the law, and doesn't correspond to clinical practice, and therefore these patients are not dead. So that's how I would frame it. So for some people who say brain death is the only real death, they would lean on the second ethical problem, that the proximal cause of death is the cutting off of the circulation. For people like me who have this other view, I would say the patients fail to meet the standards for death either legally, and I believe those are justified ethically. Though I also think if you don't believe that, I think the fallback falls where the proximal cause of death is the cutting off of the circulation to the brain. I would be remiss if I did not point out the thrust of our recent paper in the Hastings Center report, which is that at the end of the day, for all of the reasons that we've just described, it's pretty clear that NRP is ethically controversial and socially and ethically potentially problematic. NMP has none of those problems, and the evidence is it works really well. So just as a matter of parsimony, it makes no sense to me to pursue a pathway towards something that, while maybe very incrementally better, but only at most incrementally better, by a small increment, buys into all of these ethical problems and challenges. When you've got something that's improving, because NMP is researchers are continuing to find ways of making NMP better and better. And it already is, the data shows that it's already as good as the gold standard of brain death procurement. So I just think that it's there's no reason to go to something that's ethically quite controversial and problematic, and where you have to mislead patients potentially and risk undermining trust in the organ procurement process, when you've got perfectly good approaches that are ethically unproblematic and are nearly as good and constantly improving.
Oh, there's a lot there, and there's a lot. I have a lot of questions. Okay, so in regards to the comparison between the machine perfusion and the regional perfusion, if the definition of death is that it's irreversible, then wouldn't it still apply in cases when we don't do any resuscitative efforts, right? So it would equally apply to NMP patients as well, wouldn't it?
No, I don't think so. The hearts are being transfused outside the body, right?
But would it removal of the heart? Like,
No,
isn't that the controversial part?
No, you remove the heart. You don't restart circulation in the body. So you remove the patient is now dead by circulatory criteria. The heart is completely stopped. You go into a not beating heart and remove the organs in the same way you do with traditional DCD. The only difference is, instead of putting them into cold storage, you put them into a machine with some blood that you've taken and restore the circulation outside the body.
No, I get that part, but I'm saying that when they declare the patient dead, right, at that particular moment, it seems like, is it the case that that particular state is actually reversible? They're just not reversing it.
Yes. So this is a different question and raises the question about the ethics in DCDs altogether, right? So when DCDs were first starting coming to practice, this concern was raised. It's in a way unfortunate that the UDDA used the word irreversible rather than permanent. But at the time that it was done, the commissioners were using those words interchangeably. And it was clear that when they said it's irreversible, what they meant was that circulation in the body, respiratory those functions of the body are stopped and never going to be returned. Not never could return, but are never going to be returned. And that was clear, and that fits with clinical practice, right? When a patient who's not an organ donor dies in the ICU and their circulation stops and their respiratory function stops, we wait a few minutes to make sure there's no auto resuscitation. But once you get past the point of auto resuscitation, they declare the patient dead because if they're a no code, right? So if they're a no code, then you declare the patient dead right then. You don't say, well, it's true that they're a no code, but if they weren't a no code, we could potentially still resuscitate them. So we got to wait, I don't know, 20 minutes, 45 more minutes before declaring them dead. That's not clinical practice. Clinical practice is when it's permanent. If a patient is in no code and you have and their circulation and respiratory function are past the point where they're going to auto resuscitate, that's the point when they're dead, and that's when they're declared dead in the ICU.
Interesting. Yeah, okay, so then they're making a distinction between what is going to happen versus what could happen.
And I'll just say metaphysically, I think once you go down the path of what could happen, that's in a way a mug's game, because do you mean by current technology, which constantly changes, right? Before ECMO was commonly being done in adults, that where you drew that line would be different. Now that we use ECMO, that line is a different place. And if you mean like forever, well, I don't know what future technologies are going to be. Maybe there'll be ways of restoring things. Then you could never actually declare anybody dead. So that's why it really makes no sense to make it open-ended that way. It really has to be about what is going to happen. And the difference between NRP and NMP is in NMP, it satisfies the well-understood criteria that's operable both clinically and in the understanding of the UDDA at the time that it was written. Whereas in NRP, it doesn't, because actual circulation is restored.
Yeah, it's interesting there. Like, I think I'm approaching it from the perspective of a philosopher, so I think I tend to ask the more like deep and fundamental questions. It's like, oh, this particular issue raises the question of whether or not all these patients are dead when they're declared dead.
And
right?
There's a literature on that, and there was a debate about that. I will just say it's a philosophically an interesting thing to deal with and to debate about. I think the law is pretty clear. I think clinical practice is pretty clear. And I think, so I think from the point of view of worries about the dead donor rule, I think it's fine from that point of view in terms of both our well understood clinical practices and an understanding of the law. And then philosophically, I mean, you could ask whether anybody ever is dead, right? If you are a Christian and believe there's an afterlife, maybe nobody ever dies. And so there are certain kinds of I tend to be a philosopher of a stripe that's skeptical of metaphysical debates. There's a reason why we've debated them for a couple of thousand years. So I think I tend to be more sympathetic to the Dewey James perspective. These are practical problems that need to be solved, and philosophy can add a lot to solving them, but they have to be practical solutions, not purely metaphysical ones.
Yeah. So I want to return to this discussion, but before that, I want to ask you about the process of cutting off blood flow to the brain. Okay, so why did they even do that to begin with? Was it because they were afraid that the patient would come back alive?
Yes. Clearly, if you don't cut them off, it becomes, you can't even maintain the pretense that they're using to resuscitate the patient. And in addition, you have to worry that the patient may wake up, right? Depending on the nature. I mean, most patients who are DCD candidates have had, bad brain injury, but there are some exceptions. There are patients who are vent dependent, paralyzed from the waist down, and have decided they want to withdraw life support and withdraw the ventilator they need to live. We know they're likely to die quickly, so they're DCD candidates, but they have full mental capacity and they have both authorized organ procurement and withdrawal of life support. Always a very tricky and fraught ethically situation when those turn into donors. But there have been several cases where DCDs have happened on these kinds of patients. If you restore blood flow to the brain on ECMO, you better keep them knocked out well, because otherwise they may just wake up. And it's very hard to say, well, you're dead, but like, quick, knock them out, right? Because they may be hungry. Anyway, so yeah, there used to be a Harry Truman play. This is attributed to Harry Truman, of the guy who wakes up on a slab in a morgue with holding like a flower, and looks around and says, "Gosh, if I'm not dead, why am I laying on a slab in a morgue with a flower in my hand? But if I'm dead, how come I have to go to the bathroom?" So it's like there's something about you really can't say they're dead if they can say, like, I'm hungry. So anyway, so there's no question. I think there's nobody or almost nobody disputes that. There is one exception, which is one of my former trainees, Carola Kreitmeyer, who's a professor at University of Wisconsin in Madison, who says that she thinks that they shouldn't cut off blood flow to the brain and that we should say that they're dead after the 5 minutes has passed. And we just shouldn't worry about that. But almost nobody I know, both defenders and opponents of mainstream opponents and defenders of NRP, none of them agree with that stance. And I think her stance is, I think medically, I think she's assuming that you would only use these methods in cases and only do DCDs in cases where there's so much loss to the brain that when you add the loss that happens as a result of the cardiac arrest in the 5 minute period, that the brain has more or less been destroyed. But empirically, that's just not true. There are cases of DCD for patients who are not only not had massive brain damage, they're still conscious and cognitively intact.
Yeah, I don't know what the right word to describe this situation is about them like cutting off the blood flow to the brain. It's suspicious, a little shady. I don't know what, you know what I mean? Like if there wasn't that worry to begin with, then you wouldn't even have to cut blood flow to the brain. Then I feel like the ethical issues would have immediately arisen.
That is correct.
Right? So then why even continue it before figuring out the ethics of it?
I agree completely. It's also when you start to, for those of us who spend a lot of time doing clinical ethics and spend time dealing with grieving families, a lot of these kinds of organ pyramid cases are cases where you've got traumatic brain injury and things like that, where they didn't progress to brain death. But there's, they're often younger and healthier, and it can be very fraught. But imagine what you're saying to the families in these situations. For example, things are looking bad. The respirator, the ventilator, I've had many of these conversations where, even on a ventilator, you start to see they're not able to maintain support and they're not ECMO candidates, right? So the cases where patients who can't maintain their ventilation, even on a ventilator, that's kind of what we use ECMO for. So you have a conversation with the family and explain to them, since we don't think they'll ever recover to get off ECMO, we're really sorry, but they're not an ECMO candidate. But by the way, we're going to put them on ECMO in order to cure their organs. That you can understand why they don't want to tell the family that they're being put on ECMO. But that's how are you going to explain that to family? It's already hard in practice enough when we have situations where we tell families that their organs are working so poorly that we have to withdraw life support because they're not going to survive and it makes no sense to keep going. And then procure organs that we've told them are poorly functioning and give them to other people where presumably they will start functioning. And there's good reasons why that's the case. And we have to explain that, like, in their body where where say their heart is not working well. And so and they're not going to procure the heart, and their blood pressure is barely being maintained, and lots of damage is being accrued to the kidneys. The kidneys are never going to recover here. But if we take the kidneys and put them into a new body where they're going to get oxygenated properly in a way they won't in the patient's body, they can come back and they'll be able to do that in a way that we just can't for them, again, unless they're on ECMO, but they're not an ECMO candidate. Well, how are you going to explain all this to somebody where, by the way, we're going to put them on ECMO again, but just for organ procurement purposes?
Yeah, it kind of paints a very, I don't know, dark picture of the purpose of medicine sometimes. It's like, we're just treating your loved one as an organ, thing, right? And a body that just hosts organs that we now want to use to save other people, which is, ultimately it is a good thing, right? We don't want other people to die from lack of access to the organs that they need.
I think that's what drives it. The shortage of organs and the fact that you can help and save other people, combined with the fact that these are all people with terrible prognoses where the decision has already been made to withdraw life support. So these are all patients who, no matter what, are going to die. And I think at heart, the people who are many of the proponents of NRP at heart don't really believe in the dead donor rule, right? When push comes to shove, what they really think is, look, if this patient's got a horrible prognosis and the family's decided to withdraw life support, for them, they would really much rather just say, why don't we just take their organs and let them die? The problem with that is that that's a form of active euthanasia. And most of these proponents of that view of abandoning the dead donor rule are also then in favor of saying maybe we should think about legalizing active euthanasia. Why focus on withdrawal and waiting for them to die when if it's hopeless and they're not going to recover anyway? Let's just do it that way. But it's interesting that even in the countries that have legalized active euthanasia, they have been slow to allow the abandonment of the dead donor rule. Although there it may make more sense, and I will say, Canada, the Netherlands, there are active discussions about whether or not giving up the dead donor rule and allowing death by organ procurement to start to take place in those countries, where maybe then it makes more sense because then you don't have to worry about any of these other things because they allow physicians to actively kill their patients anyway or euthanize their patients. But that is so far from the U.S. context. That is not socially, culturally, or legally acceptable in the U.S. at the present time. I don't see that changing anytime in the foreseeable future. And giving up the dead donor rule means abandoning those prohibitions.
Yeah, that's interesting. The connection between this topic and active euthanasia. I think for a lot of people, they are supportive of euthanasia because they see it as good for the patient because they're relieving the patient's suffering. But in the case of organ procurement, that's not for the good of the patient. That's for the good of other patients, right? So the justifying reason would be different.
Yeah, I think what we would say in those situations is, the defenders would say is, these are patients who want to die. We were going to withdraw life support to let them die anyway. If active euthanasia is acceptable and they wanted to be an organ donor, that was important to them, then this is a way of respecting their wishes. Because right now, this is just a reality, right? For many people who want to be organ donors, they're not eligible to be donors. If you don't die in just the right way, you're not going to be eligible to be an organ donor. And I've been a part of many conversations with families say, oh, they really want to be an organ donor. And we'd say, really sorry, but they're overbreathing the vent. When they withdraw the ventilator, they will pass away, but it's going to take days, maybe even a week before they're going to pass away. They can't, if it's more than an hour, realistically, they're not going to be able to be an organ donor. So if you don't just the right way, you're not going to donate organs. Most people don't know that. Most people think that if they've registered for donating organs, if they die on the street in a car accident, their organs are taken, and they don't realize that the only way to be an organ donor is the easiest way is to have enough happen badly to your brain that you are declared dead while still on a ventilator. And the second best way is where you're just shy of that and you're vent dependent, but you're not dead, but you will die very quickly after withdrawal of the ventilator. And those are the really only two groups that are really eligible to be organ donors. And that's why there's so few organs, is because very few people meet that criteria. And so the people who want to give up the DDR say, wouldn't it, if we just allowed anybody where they withdraw life support, even if it's going to take a week, to say, I want to be euthanized by organ procurement, you would get a lot more organs. There's a utilitarian justification there. However, as John Robertson argued a long time ago, the DDR is not really, the dead donor rule is not really a utilitarian thing. It's really a deontological constraint. And there's a reason why we don't allow euthanasia, and it's got nothing to do with any kind of utilitarianism. There are deontological grounds on why people think that it's wrong to allow this to happen. And right now, our culture is not in a place where we disagree with that.
Yeah. No, I agree with everything that you just said. We would have to focus on the autonomy grounds for justifying something like active euthanasia, and then you can say, oh, look, this person wants to donate their organs, and so they're actually okay, and they will consent to being euthanized via organ procurement, right?
Yeah.
And I think there is actually, I don't know, I feel like there could be pretty strong justification for a practice like that, right? So imagine that your kid is in danger, and maybe you push him out of the way so that you get hit by the car, right? Like there are situations where we can imagine that it's actually a good thing for people to sacrifice their own lives for their loved ones or for people who they care about, right? The soldier who jumps on the grenade, all this type of scenarios.
Absolutely. But raises real questions about the practice of medicine. There are reasons for being more concerned about in the U.S. context where, one of the controversies in Oregon, even with physician-assisted death, was in California, we passed a law to make, in our version of the law, the End of Life Option Act, we don't allow this, but where a patient was seeking something slightly more experimental from their insurance company for their last-ditch effort at their cancer, and they were sent a letter saying no, but offering to pay for drugs that would allow them to die, to take their own life. And so the worry is, in a society where we have large amounts of homelessness, where medical bills are the leading cause of bankruptcy, you don't want people making those choices. Even in Canada, there was a case of a woman with a disability where she couldn't get stable housing that met her disabled needs. And so she chose active euthanasia. And in the countries where it's been legalized, there's been a tendency to go down the slippery slope of, you start with only for people who have 6 months or less to live, then it's people who are suffering, then it turns into psychiatric suffering, and then it turns into pretty much any reason. And then in societies with large parts of inequity, access to healthcare and other things, this becomes a way of providing cheaper healthcare for people. Look, we can spend the next couple of years spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to keep you alive, or we can spend $1,000 and end your life. Anyway, so all those are reasons why a society may choose not to go down that pathway. I will also add one other caveat, which is interesting, and I'll see how this pays out. There's a debate going on in the Netherlands right now. In Canada, and in many of the countries, and in the countries where physicians to death, the way it's happening in the U.S., starting in Oregon and spreading to many other states, those are almost all based on considerations of autonomy, as you just articulated, not the Netherlands. So the first law that was passed in the Netherlands, their law is actually not based on autonomy at all. It's based on compassion and worries about suffering. So what justifies physicians to take action to end somebody's life is suffering that's being discontinued. And over time, that notion of suffering has been broadened more and more and more. But it's not grounded in autonomy. So it's not clear. It's probably going to be trickier to override the dead donor rule in the Netherlands, because it's not grounded in autonomy. It's grounded in suffering, and it's not clear if a patient's vent dependent, and if you draw the vent and they'll die, there's no suffering, and they're unconscious. There's no suffering that needs to be solved by active euthanasia. They probably wouldn't be eligible in the Netherlands for active euthanasia. And so DDR is going to have a problem in the Netherlands in a way that it wouldn't in Canada, for example.
Yeah, no, all good points. I completely agree with what you're saying. So I want to go back to this concept of death, okay, that we kind of mentioned earlier. And you were saying, okay, the way that death is defined is that your circulatory system is not going to start up again, right? It may be able to be started up, like jump started by external technology, right? But it won't start. There's no auto resuscitation. Okay, so then there seems to be a distinction between some sort of like inner cause and an external cause.
Well, it has to be that it will never happen again. It'll be permanent, and
but also from an inner cause, right? Like it can't auto resuscitate.
Well, you have to be past the point of auto resuscitation. But if you get past a point of auto resuscitate and then attempt to resuscitate and it's successful, those patients are not dead, right? You don't say, "Oh, well, you're dead."
But that's because you actually successfully resuscitated them, right? Like
Correct.
It's not, yeah. Okay. Even though you could have two identical patients, and one patient you don't attempt resuscitation, and the other you do attempt resuscitation. If this one is successful, then this one is not dead, whereas this one is dead.
Correct.
And before you even resuscitate, like metaphysically, they would have to be.
Let's suppose that they averted resuscitation fails. Then what I would say is, look, if you look at the time of death, this is what happened. I've got two identical patients in two adjoining rooms. One's a no code, one's a full code. They both code. The person who's a no code, you say, they've gone, you wait 5 minutes past auto resuscitation and they're declared dead. Patient room next door, they're going to go in and try to resuscitate them. And at some point when they see it won't work, they call the time of death. The time of death for those two patients is going to be different, right? The one patient will have died 20 or 30 minutes or 40 minutes later than the other patient. And that's based on the fact that this one achieved permanent cessation of circulation after 5 minutes, and the other one didn't achieve permanent cessation of circulation, at least epistemologically as far as they knew, until they were done making those efforts and knew that they were not going to work.
It's so like trippy just thinking about like these weird metaphysical questions, right? Because you would think that if you have two identical patients, they have to be alive at the same time, and you would think that they would be dead at the same time if you do, But
that's for me, you're thinking of life and death as natural kinds.
Yeah,
and I don't. Most biological categories are not natural kinds. We have classifications for practical purposes. We look at our nosologies for disease, right? So for some diseases, we define them by by what causes them. So we call it influenza because it's the influenza that causes you to have all these signs and symptoms. For others, it's the mechanism of pathophysiology. So you can have either viral or bacterial pneumonia because they act the same way. For other things, it's just this cluster of signs and symptoms, right? So colds can work a little differently pathophysiologically. They could be caused by by any of a number of different viruses, and but they're all colds because they have the same signs and symptoms. So it's kind of a kludgy mess. It works pretty well. We make adjustments and changes. There's a history to it, and it works pretty well. It would be surprising if a folk biological category like life and death would actually or cut nature at the joints and have a very defined, like, here's where you draw it and here's where it's the same, which means these things are always negotiated. Think about the concept of adulthood. When are you an adult? Well, that really turns on the question of when can you do certain kinds of activities? And there's no magic line that says, like, at 17 years, 364 days, you're too immature to enter into certain kinds of contracts or to vote. The next day, wham, you're suddenly super mature and you can do all those things, right? So it's biological occurrences tend to be processes, not events, where you have to sort of draw artificial lines, not artificial, I shouldn't say, conventionally defined lines, usually for good reasons for why we draw them the way we draw them. And so that's just what you do in biology. And this is kind of how it works. It's what you do in medicine in building up classifications. So the classification of people as either alive or dead is, in my view, a thoroughly conventional classification that's been done, and it got a history to it, and it evolves in different ways. And you just have to respect that it's not arbitrary, that there are good reasons for drawing the lines where we draw them, but it's not like it's a natural kind. So you could say, so it seems trippy at first that this patient is dead and this patient who's in the identical circumstances died 20 minutes or 40 minutes later. But it actually makes sense because the activities that were done on those patients and the way they were treated in the context that they were in, legally and medically, were different. This was a no-code patient where the decision had been made not to attempt resuscitation. And so they died very quickly after their heart stopped. This patient was not their patient. They were going to make every effort to try and restore circulation. And so it's only when you knew that those things couldn't work anymore that you could declare them dead. It's an operational definition of death, if you like, that works very well. And that's how we do things.
I'm wondering if we can make a useful analogy with cars, right? So let's say there's some sort of like a conception of a dead car. Like you just cannot salvage this car, and you go to the mechanic, and the mechanic says, that's how we define an unsalvageable car. It's just like one, it can't auto start. But the other thing is this. So the mechanic says, I can actually start up your car again, but I'm not going to. And then that still meets the definition of a dead car because it's not going to auto start because you can't start it.
Yeah, if it turns out that nobody who's going to drive it could ever start it, and they say there's nothing I can do here, I can do something in the engine, open the engine, go in there and do that, but nobody can ever do this all the time. It's not safe to do it this way, and so this is now a dead car. Yeah, there might be no difference between those two things.
Yeah, so you can kind of see like where I'm a little, I don't know, maybe like philosophically frustrated. I don't know if that's an emotion. I'm philosophically frustrated.
Look, you want there to be, you want the concepts of life and death to name natural kinds, to carve nature at the joints. And therefore, because you have that concept, you'd have something essential. And I should say, Jim Burnett and I have now published several papers around NRP, around brain death. And he wants that too. And he thinks he's got it. And so he's got an account. And there are other people who have that. Adam Emiliachuk, the first author on these couple of papers that we're talking about, who was one of my former trainees, who's now a professor at Baylor. He is also a realist who thinks that there is a line to be drawn. And there are people out there who believe that there is a line to be drawn, and here's the criteria, and here's how we do this. I am just skeptical because my initial background was in philosophy of science and philosophy of biology. And I think there's a lot of naivete about how science and biology work at play with a lot of the people involved in this debate. Like I early in my career, I dealt a lot with the questions about like species concepts. Most of our taxonomic categories do not carve nature at the joints. Even the ones where there's a little bit of a debate, like species concepts, everyone very quickly says, well, kind of, but not really. And it's just very hard to maintain that any of our biological classifications, that doesn't mean they're arbitrary, but just because they're not arbitrary that doesn't mean they're not conventionally defined, and that you couldn't have had another system that divided things up differently that could have historically evolved and that could work perfectly fine. Our nosologies could have done that too. And, if you think about psychiatry, has probably got the most articulated nosology. And, they've gone through, whatever it is, 10 versions of the 10 plus versions of the diagnostic statistical manual that lays out their nosology. And it evolves over time, and they make changes and they debate things to decide how they're going to divide things up. But it's silly to think that that carves nature up at the joints. And so I understand you want concepts of life and death to do that, and why you want to say this carves nature at the joints. So you have this essential thing. It's a very philosophically common instinct. It is, however, I think, one to be avoided. I think the later Wittgenstein, if you read the philosophical investigations carefully, it can help cure you of that instinct. But I think it's an incorrect instinct. And the other thing that can cure you is learning a lot about philosophy, biology, and how biology works, or physics for that matter. I mean, Nancy Cartwright and Ian Hackings, Nancy was one of my former professors when I was a grad student. Physics just doesn't work the way philosophers want it to. Philosophers have a simple view about how the world works. Unfortunately, the world is very complicated. And so I understand the impulse, but it's just, I don't think it's reasonable.
Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying. But then if we're not demanding some sort of like philosophical rigor and philosophical consistency, then we can just change what the law says about what death is, right?
I don't think that's true. I think, again, there's a difference between saying that it's not written and, you're not carving nature at the joints, and saying it's completely arbitrary. I think there are good reasons why we draw lines the way we do and why we do things the way they do. I think you can't just arbitrarily change things. I think if society changes and culture changes to make certain practices more acceptable. So what may be dissatisfying to some is that, on my view, it's not impossible that our mores and culture would change and our laws would change in such a way that we would abandon the dead donor rule and change the definition of death that would make NRP acceptable. And I think all those things are true. I however, do not believe they are true of the current definition of the law, UDDA, and the culture that it represents. And so currently the way that we do things, I think, is appropriate and justified in the way that we do things. And NRP violates those things in a way that I think is problematic. But I don't think you need to appeal to metaphysics to do that. And I think it's probably less successful. Once you start to appeal to underlying metaphysical views about things that you have to do, then the problem is we don't have agreement about those underlying metaphysics, right? So one person says, no, I really think NRP patients are really dead because the only thing that matters is the brain. And once you have this, and another person says, no, I think it's this. And I think once you have this much damage, it's really higher functioning. Once the patient's lost higher cognitive functioning, even though they're not dead by the UDDA and by current clinical practice, I really think they're really dead because everything that made them who they are have been lost. And so for a lot of the patients who we're talking about, not all, but many of them, they're already dead on this definition, on the so-called higher brain definition. They're already dead. And so then you don't even have to you don't have to worry about resuscitating them. You can just go in and take the organs because they should have been declared dead because we had permanent loss of everything that made them who they are, right? Once you get into metaphysics, that's just not a very good basis for policy. That's not part of what you really need to do. It should be plausible within generally accepted metaphysical beliefs, but turning to metaphysics for giving the exact answer for these kinds of questions is a hopeless task if what you need are, broadly acceptable policies. So I think grounding it in clinical practice and in what's socially acceptable is much more, and then the law is a much firmer basis.
No, I hear what you're saying. Yeah, you can't rely on philosophers as kind of come up with the lies, because philosophers have been debating this issue and will continue to debate this issue for thousands of years. I totally understand that. I think the point I'm trying to make is that whatever principles that we are using to pass these policies, to justify these policies, they have to be internally consistent.
I agree with that.
Right? So, and this is where it kind of like why this issue seems to be very controversial, it is controversial, right? Because there seems to be inconsistencies within the principles that we already adopt, that we use to pass these laws with.
I completely agree. I think there's no question to my mind that NRP is incompatible with UDVA as written, as understood by the people who wrote them, as it was interpreted by them, and violates the dead donor rule, which is currently incompatible with current, well, not just medical practice, but current law. So I completely think that is correct. Even if you don't accept that, I think you wind up having to say that they're really dead because of the loss of functioning to the brain, and that does the work. Then you have to say that the proximal cause of death is not the heart stopping, but the stopping of the circulation, and so it still doesn't get around that. I just don't see how you can justify NRP in our current context with our current laws and our current understanding of how we conventionally have drawn the line between life and death.
Yeah, no, thank you. One last thing I wanted to bring up, and this is just me just trying to imagine how such a practice arose, right? You have the goal of procuring more organs. I totally understand that. I think everybody can understand that. But then you have these smart, doctors think of new ways to procure more organs, right? And then somebody or some team comes up with a way. They're like, hey, maybe we could do this, right? Let's try it, but let's clamp the blood vessels to the brain, right? There was some thought in that process that made them do what they did.
Yeah, I think that evolved a little bit more piecemeal than that, right? Which is, I think before, so the kind form of, there's actually two forms of NRP. And the form of NRP that's raising most of the concerns that we're describing about is where you're cutting off the blood flow to the brain so that you can, and the heart function is restored. But before that came into practice, people started to introduce the introduction of use of ECMO for blood flow just to like the liver or liver and kidneys, and where blood flow was cut off to the heart. And it really was very localized and regionalized. So the initial idea was, I bet we can get better liver and hearts if we just like provide some blood flow to this organ right here. And that didn't seem as ethically fraught, right? To just take one single organ and do it that way, or maybe the liver and the kidneys and just do that. And then the blood flow was cut off because you didn't want blood flow, partly for practical reasons. You didn't want it circulating widely. You wanted to oxygenate these organs, and having to oxygenate the whole cavity would have made it harder to do. So you were just trying to do these things. Now, it did cut off blood flow to the brain, but it did that because it also cut off blood flow to the heart and everything above those lower abdominal organs. And so that was the practice that first started and was not as controversial. There's still people who think that's still restoring circulation, but it's not as controversial. There's a little more disagreement about whether that's problematic. And it was then people saying, well, if we can do this, why not just do it higher, cut off the blood flow to the brain, and then we can now get hearts. And I think that's how it historically developed. You started with a practice that, it was a little bit of a Sortes argument almost. Like, surely if all I do is restore blood flow to a single kidney, surely that's not restoring circulation. And that's true. Surely if I restore blood flow to the two kidneys, if I restore two kidneys and the liver, it's like, where do you draw the line? And to me, if the heart is beating on its own and functioning on its own and all of the organs are functioning, at that point, you've restored circulation. And you've resuscitated the patient. But in any case, there is a sort of effort at a Sortes argument by some who say, if you think this is okay and this is okay, where do you draw the line? We draw the line at cutting off blood flow to the brain, and that's what justifies it.
Yeah, it's such an interesting topic. I think it's a good place to wrap things up. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.